Welcome to the reality show. Today we're talking about, well, the title is Israel Presents How to Lose a War, but we're going to be talking about specific aspects of what Israel is doing and at this very moment, or what it is holding back on rather than do. I am joined by Alejandro, Marco, and Richard. Hey guys, how's it going?
Well, thank you.
Good, thanks. Yeah, thank you.
So we've talked on this channel about Israel's operation in uh, Rafah, the operation that hasn't started, that the world is warning about. The world is warning about what the situation would be for Palestinians if that operation happens. Of course, the world and the international community at the same time, parts of it are calling for Hamas to release the hostages, and we know how Hamas likes to listen to the West on such matters or any matters. But of course, there is no release of the hostages. Even in these negotiations, there is Israel's only actual bargaining power is the fact that it can militarily destroy Hamas and is taking steps in that direction. But it is not taking those steps in Rafah yet, and according to reports, it has given the Palestinians until March 10th to release all the hostages, or else, and unfortunately, we've heard that from Israel before. Alejandro, your first thoughts on this?
The I think what I was taking a look at is how this all surrounding the Ramadan period. Like they apparently what the West is trying to force and to push for is for the war to stop, or at least to have a ceasefire before Ramadan starts, and Ramadan starts in March 10th. And I mean, maybe we will talk a bit more about the role of religion in the whole conflict, because I think at the end everything surrounds that. But the whole way in which this is addressed is as it has been addressed over the last months, especially the as a war has progressed, and that is that the only thing that matters is Israel to surrender to some extent, because there are civilians involved.
Marco.
Well, I think it's sure to disgraceful what's happening right now. Israel has been conducting a war of self-defense following October the 7th. They have been taking all sorts of flack for the international, so-called international community, no such a thing, and they've been carrying on trying and eradicate Hamas from Gaza. Now they have been losing young people's life in this enterprise. They have managed to move as far as Rafah, and then when there are a few more operations from total victory and eradication of Hamas, they decide to balk at the request of the West and of other countries who haven't really got skin in the game, apart from their political, wannabism, and they decide to give a break to Hamas in order to give them a chance to gather their strength and rearrange where the hostages are kept, rearrange where the important military arsenals are kept. I just don't understand why at this point, when you only would need another push, you stop. Why you could eradicate the monster of Hamas. And yes, you're going to have some casualties because the population is there. But then again, all these casualties are put in danger by Hamas. All the civilians' lives that are potentially in danger from a Israeli operation have been in danger by Hamas. So why stop now? I really don't understand.
And these negotiations that are supposedly taking place behind the scenes, the various offers on both sides, including a 4.5-month ceasefire proposed by Hamas, following the withdrawal, to which is supposed to be followed by the withdrawal of the Israelis, and then we'd release the hostages. Yeah, right. And on the other side, this supposed trading off of human bodies for human bodies. Even the term negotiations on this score, it's just deeply sickening, to be honest. I mean, if you happen to have seen the Daily Objective just before this episode, with its extremely harrowing details in it, and then you want to add negotiations with those people to the end of that, end of those details, and treat that as if you're negotiating with like some union in a Western country, then you have seriously dropped some major essentials and major principles and major moral compass in even entertaining such an idea. And that's the problem here, is the fact that the chief of Hamas is supposedly in Egypt at the moment with a publicly announced trip. I mean, isn't that a guy that should be on a wanted list by every country in the world? Why isn't he under arrest? The fact that he's acting as if he's a head of state, equivalent to a Netanyahu or a Rishi Sunak or Joe Biden or whatever, is just vile.
Yeah, and again, it is Israel negotiating. By the way, I urge people once again to go and watch the episodes we did right after the attack on October 7th, on October 8th. We're not prophets, but we did pretty much say how Israel is going to behave and how the world is going to behave, because we've seen it before. We haven't seen an attack on such a scale, so we haven't seen a response on such a scale. But we have seen this, and Hamas has seen this. This is why they took hostages. Again, Hamas's only goal is to kill as many Jews as they can until they kill the last Jew. So why would they take any hostages alive? Because they know it furthers their goal of killing the Jews. Every hostage means potentially many more dead Jews. So that's why they did it, and Israel played right into its hands. And Israeli society, which is, I think, worthy of its own episode, has also played into Hamas's hands, because while right after October 7th there was unity, there was unity around the cause of destroying Hamas. There was no doubt that had to be done. Now, and I remember reading in the media about the protests, the people going out on the street in the West and celebrating October 7th, and Israeli media reported it as pro-Hamas protest, which was unusual, because usually they'll call it pro-Palestinian, and I think either is valid, but it was unusual to say, look, these people are actually celebrating what happened. Now Israeli media reports only about how the government is reluctant to do what's right, which is a hostage deal, which is, again, not just not destroying Hamas, but strengthening them. And every piece of potential, part of this negotiation is something that would strengthen Hamas. Because if they did do a 4.5-month ceasefire, obviously it would strengthen them, as do these weeks that Israel gives them to prepare. I saw Netanyahu speak a few days ago. It's in English, and he was giving a speech, and he was saying how, look, the world told us it's going to be impossible, it's going to be a death trap, and so on. It's like he's forgetting that over 200 soldiers died in this operation, who would not have died. Would not have died if Israel had attacked from the air and protected those soldiers, but who probably maybe some of them would not have died had the operation began earlier. So I want to thank our super chatters quickly. Thank you, Jonathan. Jonathan says only ARCUK has the moral clarity to present this programming. Thank you. And Enric, thank you. Enric says the Israeli government's priority needs to reverse from importance to the international community to the future of Israel. That would be nice, but it's not going to happen. Thank you, Catherine, for the super chat, and thank you, Jeff, for the super chat as well. Alejandro.
Now, I wanted to highlight, we've mentioned before the bias of the media of the West, and in one of the articles in the BBC talks about this, about what's happening. And in essence, they are talking about how the negotiations are going and how Israel is quite reluctant to go about it. But I think what I'm going to read reflects how the bias is passed to people as seemingly to be objective. And the paragraph says that Israel is also said to be adding new issues to the negotiating table against, and therefore adding friction to the negotiations. And now I continue, including its accusation that Hamas failed to deliver medicines to hostages as part of an effective immediate mediated by Qatar and France. And Mr. Netanyahu has also been criticized for calling back on presenting any counterproposals until Hamas comes back with more acceptable offers. Now, I think, first of all, that puts Hamas in a very bad light. But who are what I'm trying to say, or what I'm trying to talk about with the lack of objectivity from the BBC, is that they're not mentioning who the critics of these measures are. And it's very easy to pass that information as report when in reality it's just the opinion of the BBC writer. And it doesn't necessarily reflect the opinion of either Israel or the public or the UN, where it might be. And now that you mentioned it, Razi, maybe it's a case that Israelis are more open to fasten up to quicken the negotiations. I'm a bit interested in that, but as well, I think you have a whole push of the whole West trying to say, "Hey, Israel, you're being too tough here. You have to give up. You have to give up some slack. You know, people are in Rafah and they're suffering, and if you attack more, you have 2 million people there. Something could happen there, and don't forbid, they're going to be starving in 2 weeks. So." And not starving because there's no food, starving because it's Ramadan. So, anyways, what I'm trying to say is, it's pretty bleak from the side of the West, which should be supporting this cause.
Yeah, and by the way, of course, there are not 2 million people there. I don't know how many there are, but if the Palestinians say there are 2, and I think even the Palestinians claim it's like 1.5 million or something, but they change their numbers all the time. And they remember, everything that comes out of there is for the purpose of feeding Western anti-Israel sentiment, and of course the West laps it up, so it's working. But yeah, Marco.
To be honest, even if there were 15 million, I wouldn't care. It would be 15 million people who are still holding hostages that were taken October 7, nearly 5 months ago. You cannot even understand why the West is even taking Hamas seriously. Hamas is dictating condition for releasing the hostages that they took from Israel. This is just beyond preposterous. The terms from those murderous monkeys comes actually and is taken seriously. It's just beyond the pale, really. I can't believe that anyone in the West takes this thing seriously. And we're often accused of pointing out the failures of the people in Gaza and dehumanizing them. Well, the reason we're actually doing the opposite. We know they're human beings. They're perfectly functioning human beings who choose to live in misery and violence. Yes, the children are innocent, but the children are largely bred for martyrdom. It's their parents' fault if a single child in Gaza or Rafah suffers. They could surrender right now. They could release all the hostages, and they could denounce Hamas. At this point, Hamas shouldn't be particularly strong. It's been dealt quite a significant blow. So the people of Gaza, if they were so willing to use whatever's left of the moral compass, they should hand over Hamas and try and, if anything else, to save their own skin. But they don't care about that. They choose to live a parasitic lifestyle, hiding behind the definition of fourth-generation refugee, and then playing the victim throughout. Well, if you choose that, if you choose not to give up the people, and we know that the last 2 hostages saved by an operation in Rafah from the IDF were protected by civilians, were in a residential area. So there's no 2 ways about it. People in Gaza are responsible for their own misery, and Israel shouldn't give a toss about it. They should just go in, save as many hostages as they can, destroy Hamas until the last bit of them is left. Nobody should be left after the operation.
The precedent of previous hostage negotiations also hangs so heavily over this, because at every stage you facilitated and encouraged the next set and even the concept to exist. We've talked in the past about some of the ludicrous transfers, and even back before Christmas, when 105 hostages were exchanged for 240 Palestinian prisoners. And the proposal that's on the table right now, the 1,500 prisoners should be released in order to free 4 female hostages. This trading of chips, or even the proposal that it should exist, is just so obscene. And what's even more obscene is, on the one hand, you've got the evil, and on the other hand, you've also got the evil appeasers. And it's the second group that facilitate and enable the first every time, whether it's and this hostages example is just an example of that. And then yesterday, in Parliament here in the UK, some rather chaotic scenes in Parliament when they were debating a ceasefire vote on Gaza in the Houses of Parliament in Britain. And outside in Parliament Square, there's a big protest going on, and shining up and down the tower of Big Ben, the symbol of Western values, the symbol of the mother of all parliaments and the country that we live in, is the phrase "Gaza ceasefire now, and from the river to the sea, let Palestine be free," in massive letters right up and down the tower, in lights. It beggars belief. It beggars belief that occurs off the back of what happened on October 7th, all of the details that have emerged about it since, and then all the levels of appeasing the fact that people can do that on Big Ben and identify Britain in any form on the side of such evil.
Yeah, and the fact that they tie those 2 slogans together, we know what "from the river to the sea" means. It means kill all the Jews. And then they say ceasefire now, which is not a very, ceasefire, again, is one of those words you don't associate with murder, but that's what it means. It means stop firing now because you're firing back. Stop it. Let them regroup. Let them plan to let the Palestinian people prepare to be Palestinians again and do what they do. Bonnie, I want to thank you for the comment. Bonnie says, someone pointed out 100 refugees in Rafah and no one knows where they are. Gazans know. Yes, they know. And even those who don't know are guilty. And I will get to that in a moment. I want to get to Jonathan Honig's super chat. Thank you, Jonathan. Jonathan says, please remind us how Ayn Rand described the Arabs in the Donahue interview. It's a good thing that I have my copy of Ayn Rand Answers right next to me. And so the question in 1973, this question was, what should the United States do about the Arab-Israeli war? This was the Yom Kippur War. And first she says, before getting to Jonathan's point, she says, give all help possible to Israel. Consider what is at stake. It is not the moral duty of any country to send men to die helping another country. The help Israel needs is technology and military weapons, and they need them desperately. Why should we help Israel? Israel is fighting not just the Arabs, but Soviet Russia, who is sending the Arabs armaments. Russia is after control of the Mediterranean and oil. Further, and I think this is the point Jonathan was referring to, why are the Arabs against Israel? And and she says in parentheses here, this is the main reason I support Israel. The Arabs are one of the least developed cultures. They are still practically nomads. Their culture is primitive, and they resent Israel because it's the sole beachhead of modern science and civilization on their continent. When you have civilized men fighting savages, you support the civilized men no matter who they are. And by the way, the use of Arabs here as opposed to Palestinians, because this is 1973, it is about a decade after the Palestinian people were invented, but it took some time to catch on. So nobody referred to Palestinians back then. There was one other point I wanted to make. Yeah, Marco, you said something about children are always innocent. That is true, but we need to remember in Gaza, nobody else is. And that is certainly in the context of war and how you fight a war, nobody in Gaza is actually innocent. There are no innocent civilians. And if you fight thinking there are innocent civilians and we need to protect them, you do so at the expense, at the cost of the lives of the people you are meant to protect. The only reason for Israel to exist is to protect its citizens from such atrocities, and yet it protects the enemy. So, and in order to protect that enemy, it tells itself and the world this lie of innocent civilians on the Palestinian side. Alejandro.
What I wanted to say is that it's related to Richard's point. The big story here, speaking even beyond of what's happening in Israel, is that the West is crumbling down. In 2020 and 2021, the story was that the West was crumbling inside, incapable of answering and responding to the threat of COVID and the whole notion of how to handle it in a rights respecting way. And the West failed dismally, except for the South Korea and Taiwan and Sweden to some extent. And 2022 and 2023 have been the years where the West was challenged externally in an indirect way through Ukraine, but mainly because Russia felt that the West was weak because of energy issues, as well as what had happened in Afghanistan, very probably. But as well, this whole attack of October 7th, I think it's also related to that. The people in Hamas perceived probably that there was an internal combat and an internal incapability of Israel because of the I mean, I'm not talking about discovering warm water, but I think the internal conflicts of Israel are basically what incentivized Hamas to further the attacks. But what we're seeing now, in part, in what's happening in Parliament, not only of the UK but on the West, the change of heart in the US right now is essentially the lack of the West to stand for themselves, because we've lost any resemblance and pride on the achievements of what's happened, any notion and clarity on what's the objective, on what should be done, on who should be respected and who should be treated well. When you have intellectuals trying to defend the worst of society, and I'm not talking about just this case, but when you hear how worried they are for criminals in El Salvador, worrying that they are really well treated, when they are talking about how Muslims should be Muslims in the protest should be taken well care of, and they should have the right to say that the river to the sea, everything should be allowed. You are saying that the West has no spine, and if that continues, then this will be the story of the next years as well.
Just quickly, thank you, Jonathan, for the additional super chat. And Jonathan asks, remember what my suggestion was about the hostages like 2 months ago? I don't remember, but if you can remind me, I will read it out. Marco.
Yeah, the weakness of the West, that's true. But I think the weakness of the West is also our politicians. I don't think most of the population is behind the behavior of the politicians, especially here in Britain and America as well, because we have elections this year. We are seeing politicians effectively regrouping and making sure they protect their own electoral base. For example, here in Britain, the Labour Party, famously anti-Semitic Labour Party, is a lefty party, has been trying to move itself away from the label of anti-Semitism that rightly gained during the years of Corbyn leadership. And the new leader, Keir Starmer, has been resisting calls for a ceasefire, but he had to cave in just a couple of days ago. But he is not calling it a ceasefire; he's calling it a humanitarian ceasefire, because humanitarianism is good. So a ceasefire done for the good of humanity has to be good. But hang on a second, any kind of ceasefire, humanitarian or not, is going to help Hamas to regroup. It's going to help Hamas to survive. And Israel will be attacked over and over again, like Hamas promised to do. Politicians right now, in the West, are just appeasing the Muslim vote. Just today, I came across a website called Muslim Vote or something like that, where effectively whoever is behind it, a bunch of Muslims presumably, are listing which seats, in which constituencies here in Britain are vulnerable to the Muslim vote. Effectively, some members of parliament have got a very slim majority, and the number of Muslims in their constituency will be enough to unseat them. Now it looks like there's going to be some sort of political movement based on the religion of Islam to support the Labour Party here, because the Labour Party is it's anti-Semitic, but not anti-Semitic enough for certain people. It's not calling for the destruction of Israel. So for certain Islamist nutters here in Britain, that's not enough. You have to be really proper hardcore murderers, like most of them are. This is going to cause such a big upheaval in the political landscape. We're seeing the same thing happening in the United States, with Biden desperately trying to charm his Muslim vote base in certain key states. And all this seems to be, they seem to be treating Israel like a nuisance, because right now they could really do without having to deal with the Palestinian cause. They don't want to be seen to fall in the path of Israel. Firstly, because, as Orlando said, they haven't got any moral principle to work on. So they can't really understand why Israel needs to defeat Hamas. And second, because they're too worried about being seen as anti-Muslim and therefore lose the vote.
I certainly agree. It's election season all over the place, and that's affecting a lot of what politicians are saying. I think what's happening within populations within the various countries in Europe and in America is far too much head in the sand. They're not willing to listen to the details behind, like October the 7th, for example. So they're able to compartmentalize their thinking and concentrate on images here, images there, and to just say, I want war to end, and empty, vacuous phrases like that, without understanding what brought us here, what is the nature of the two parties who are fighting one another, or the nature of the party defending itself from barbarism, to be more precise. So I think what was particularly telling in like the debate in Parliament last night was not the white noise about procedural nonsense or any of that stuff, but how the various parties, how their various stances put into words, put into a paragraph each, for the SNP, the Scottish National Party, for the Labour Party, and for the Conservative Party, the governing party. The very slight, really, differences between each of them. It's a matter of emphasis. It's a matter of words. It's a matter of what you start with at the beginning of that paragraph and what you end with. But essentially, they're all really calling for the same thing, I can give you a quick flavour of the differences between them. The Scottish National Party are the most hardcore on the side of Hamas. They talk about Gaza being the largest refugee camp in the world, and demand an end to the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. That's their opening gambit. Labour says the ground offensive in Rafah risks catastrophic humanitarian consequences and therefore must not take place. That's according to Labour. But they note that Israel cannot be expected to cease fighting if Hamas continues with violence, but they still want a two-state solution. And the Tories, whilst they start by acknowledging that Israel's right to self-defense, they urge a negotiation to agree immediate humanitarian pause. And they express concern at the military offensive in Rafah and want to see a credible pathway to a two-state solution. So you can't put much of a fag paper between those various outcomes of those three sets of explanations as to what their position is. And they pretend there's an enormous gulf between them, really, when really they're all appeasing the evil that we've seen, and they're all calling for Israel to back off and essentially surrender.
Yeah, and that's the sad state of British politics, which is, yeah, you know, Keir Starmer, the leader of Labour, is by no means pro-Israel. He is, you know, I think it's safe to call him anti-Israel, but again, not anti-Israel. Marco, I think you said it's not anti-Israel enough for most of his party. You know, he's not openly supporting Hamas, so he's considered a Zionist by some within his party. And yeah, I can't really find the difference between what the shadow foreign secretary and the foreign secretary said. They seem to be very much on the same side of this. What does it mean if Hamas continues fighting? So does Israel should Israel have stopped on October 7th, like done nothing then if Hamas had stopped, you know, in the evening? And the humanitarian pause is another one that's it's interesting. Will let's say there's a humanitarian pause. Will David Cameron at some point say, "Okay, actually, it's been long enough. You know, this pause is over. Now let's continue with the goal of crushing Hamas"? No. So these people are essentially all on the same side, and that's where British politics is today. And unfortunately, much of British society is on the side of fully supporting the people who committed the atrocities on October 7th. The atrocities that if you want the grim details of, watch today's episode of the Daily Objective. The details you hear there, that is what people are siding with when they call for a ceasefire. Alejandro.
I probably disagree with Marco regarding the state of British people thinking that maybe this is just politics. Or this is just the politicians. I think actually the fact that it's election season reveals a lot about the preferences of the electorate. And I've been surprised about how the Conservatives, now that they have almost nothing to lose, and that the only criticizable thing that has come out of Labour has been the anti-Semitism issue. They haven't pressed against Labour a lot, and the only thing that could have crumbled the party, and I think that is because a good chunk of the British electorate is unwilling to be more pro-Israel. And I was also surprised, as maybe the audience knows, yesterday there was the Parliament issue where, as Richard mentioned, they tried to present basically a motion where the Parliament would have a position against the ceasefire, and the SNP, the Scottish party, said essentially, we want a full ceasefire, as Richard mentioned, but then the Labour Party, against all protocol, asked the Speaker to water down the statement, and there was a massive backlash from the Tories. But what I think it was interesting was the commentators. And the commentator that I listened to was Nigel Farage, which I think is one of the most followed commentators from the right. And his answer to this issue wasn't, this is appalling. How on earth people want to hear about this? It's like, oh no, I don't want to talk about something as foreign and far away from this country. This parliament is so unfocused on the people, on the crisis of living cost of living crisis, on the economy, which is true, but at the same time there's willingness just to talk about the issues from the inside and not wanting to intervene or focus on what's happening abroad. And I think it's relevant as well in the notion of the West trying to retract itself, trying to step back and not be interested in what's happening in the world and be self-righteous on what's right and wrong. That is the respect of individuals.
Marco.
Well, I think the issue we had in Parliament is a bit more complex than that, because effectively it was the Labour Party seemed to have put pressure on the Speaker, who should be although he's a member of the Labour Party, he should be an impartial guardian of propriety within the Houses of Commons. So he should make sure that the procedures are followed, and what the members of Parliament should do is done. And he seems to have caved in on an issue which allows the Labour Party unusually to bypass a procedure which would force them to take an open position on the issue of the ceasefire. Effectively, they've been allowed not to vote on the SNP proposal in order not to show the cards and not to come down on the side of Israel or Palestine, or at least not being perceived by their own electorate like that, which is disgraceful, because effectively the possibly the party which would possibly win the next general election has been given a carte blanche to hide its own agenda in order to take advantage of the Muslim vote. If they were forced to vote against the motion of the SNP, if they chose to do that, they would have looked like too soft on Israel, and so they would have lost the Muslim vote. And they managed to fudge the procedure, in fact, to go against what the procedure of Parliament is. By the way, a procedure which was introduced on request of the Labour Party about 30 years ago. So this whole thing is much more sinister, because not only sets a bad precedent in our procedural in the legislative chamber, but allows for a party to get away literally with murder.
I think it can be put really simply as well, is that Labour is trying to hide how many are still within its ranks who would like the harshest possible attitude towards Israel imaginable. But they're trying to hide it from the middle ground of the electorate, the middle decent people of the country, so that they can still get it across the line and get elected later in the year without revealing that they contain such an element of haters among their midst. What happens after that election, should they win, remains to be seen, and who will take the dominant hand in driving Labour Party policy and Labour attitudes towards Israel and geopolitics, and even what happens within the UK will depend on the numbers of each faction within it. And of course, the outcome of what Marco was talking about earlier in terms of the Muslim bloc vote, whether it goes with Labour and it seeks to control Labour from within, or whether it seeks to have its own separate coalition with Labour as its own unit that drives Labour from outside or forces them in a particular direction. But I mean, all of that might sound very parochial, but this is the crossover between what's going on in Israel and the Western values that are crumbling and not being defended, as Alejandro was pointing out. I think the other thing that I heard David Lammy of the Labour Party say, which is also relevant here, is that he used the phrase, "We're just mirroring the language of the UN." And that just goes to show what clout the UN has for covering the cowardice and the hypocrites and the evil positions of all sorts of people by giving it the veneer of authority that the UN is supposed to provide. So if we can get the UN to say something, then we can just parrot it out, and that allows us to do what we wanted to do anyway. But you know, we've got the UN behind us. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just the clout that the UN has, it's how untouchable they are. You know, no matter what happens, the UN, imagine, you know, okay, so they can say, look, we didn't know the details of what's going on with UNRWA. I mean, imagine anybody in a private company doing that. Imagine in Enron, you know, somebody saying, look, this was somebody fudged the numbers. It's nothing to do with me. You know, this is almost unique to the UN, because even within any, at least Western country, you have some accountability. People, you know, will oppose you if you do something wrong. And yeah, the UN, why would you mirror the organization that educated the people who did October 7th is a question I'm sure nobody asked David Lammy yesterday. Something that I guess the Conservative Party is supposedly the pro-Israel among the pro-Israel party among the parties in parliament, and they are in power at the moment. They yesterday or the day before dropped some humanitarian aid on Gaza, and you know, it made me think about this. Why do they call it humanitarian aid and not just aid? You know, why the word humanitarian? Because that supposedly separates it from what it actually is, which is aid. It is fuel for the people who committed the atrocities to keep fighting. And you know, I don't know if this is if you know, the people who make these decisions are honest to themselves about it, but there is no other way. If there was no humanitarian aid, if there was no fuel sent to Gaza since October 7th until today, this war would have been over by now. But yeah, we still unfortunately we still buy those slogans over the fact on the ground. Alejandro.
What I was thinking about is the UN. Why, I mean, we're talking about how the West is crumbling down, and people are losing a lot of respect for its institutions, its capabilities, and the things that it did in the past, and how the UN appears to be untouched. Like imagine if there was like Thanos, like in the what's the name, in the Avengers, just did this and eradicate all the people that work in the UN. The UN would be replaced tomorrow because people. And I think if we want to explain why, it would require us to do a whole reality show. But I think that, in essence, the most legitimate institutions, the institutions that were essentially created, or at least the seeds of their creation were implanted in the 19th century, were infected with a type of virus during the early 20th century in most of the West, a type of virus which seemed to be part of that original institutions, but in reality was the seed of their destruction. The whole notion of adding, for instance, in the US, the Bill of Rights, the whole idea of trying to sort out problems, that is economic problems via the IMF, or to sort out the international problems first by the League of Nations and then the UN. They sounded like liberal and ideal purposes. But in reality, what they did and what they had in essence in their conception was lack of individual justice, that it should have been captured in this in their institutions. And therefore, what has happened is that the most legitimate institutions have taken over and have earned a bad name for the legitimate institutions. But however, the culture is so enamored with the notion of the welfare state, or that is things that I think are illegitimate, or the UN, that the inertia of the things that are really bad is probably going to continue, and that's really tragic.
Marco.
I don't think most of the population is against the protection of human rights. I believe most of the population understands. If they were allowed to understand what actually is behind here, the politicians are trying to protect a lifestyle which comes from the Middle East or wherever. They're trying to pretend that the way of life of Palestine is not different from ours. When most people understands that all Hamas and the people like them wants to push is a return to the Middle Ages. It's the subjugation of your own life to a God that doesn't exist. It's pushing back any equality for women by a few hundred years. Is having 2, 3, 5 wives because women in the Muslim world don't count for anything. They're just things. So all this kind of regression that is being pushed either under the guise of multiculturalism, let's respect a culture different from ours, or under the guise of the protection of the environment. Let's stop using gas and electricity. Let's live in caves because it's better for the environment. All the crap that came during the COVID crisis, when we were locked in our own houses because there was a bout of sniffles going around. All this kind of clamping down of individual rights, it's been pushed, and they're expecting the population to accept it. Most people can see through this, and most people prefer to live in a free society rather than buckle over and declare, yeah, okay, I'm happy to be a slave. Not many people are willing to do that, and most people don't understand actually that this is the ultimate conflict. That's what's behind the struggle between Israel and Gaza. That's what it means for Israel to overtake and be victorious on the struggle, because Israel represents exactly all the values that we hold here in the West, in the civilized world. Nobody wants to go back to the Middle Ages, but most people don't see it. But if they stopped for a second, and I'm sure the next elections will actually show that people can see through it, and most people will say no. Already in Europe, there is a massive push to the right, not because Europe has suddenly turned to a totalitarian kind of mood, but because they are pushing back to the stuff that's been imposed by the politicians.
And not that the right is providing the answer either. It's just where they've ended up because of where they've been pushed to by the long-term evasions of everybody else. And that's what's produced this trend. And I think it's that evasion being the standard MO for politicians and for populations on so many issues for so long, that it's really coming to a head, and will inevitably come to a head, because eventually reality kicks back. It's kicking back in a violent way before our eyes, and it becomes ignorable even for those who live thousands of miles away for it, and who would prefer to treat that as a foreign problem that I don't have to worry about, because it's also on your doorstep as well. I think people want to return to their comfort zones too readily, and just take comfort in ignoring it. And I think to be fair to the Conservatives, on one point they did in their amendment, or in their piece in Parliament, they did stress I can't remember the exact phrase they used, but something like the gender-based violence that was part of the Hamas attacks on October 7th. and that the references to that have been glaringly omitted by all of the other parties that speak loudly on gender issues on every single occasion they possibly can, and are so blind to this that it is so obviously intentional, so obviously deliberate, that they will refuse to acknowledge the most hideous behavior towards women, but also men and children on October 7th, and that can't stand.
So you guys probably remember before October 7th on this show, I would often, when we talked about British politics, I would get accused, hopefully jokingly or half jokingly, of being a Labour supporter. And a part of the reason, which I'm not, by the way, for anybody who hasn't watched me reply on those episodes, the reason was mostly because I was criticizing the Conservatives for moving Britain to the left of where it was under Labour, and it's often, if you go through specific points of economic policy, it is it's across the board. Like, the Conservatives have moved Britain to the left of what the Labour government was. Not, I don't think they're to the left of what Labour will be in the next government. I don't think Labour is going to move back to more free market policy. But I think that's not unique to Britain. I think the world is moving to, if you want to call it the left, I'd call it collectivism, because I don't think it's necessarily left wing. I mean, we see the right with all weird sorts of movements like national conservatism. I mean, national conservatism is basically fascism with another name. And if that is the alternative to the left, then I think, yeah, there's a move towards collectivism. There's also, by the way, this move, if you look at the American right, has definitely also changed some people's attitudes towards Israel. There are big chunks of the right now who are supporting the Palestinians. Why? I mean, is it their shared love for their imaginary friend? I don't know, but it is scary times. The West is moving in a very bad direction, and that is across the political spectrum. That it's not unique to the left, even though we see more of it maybe now from the left. Anyway, final few minutes. Any last thoughts, Alejandro?
No. Do you want to talk about the rockets, or leave it for the next day?
What rocket? What did I miss?
The Trident.
Oh, yes, of course I wanted to talk about Trident, but we don't have time. Actually, I wanted to talk about Trident in this context of Britain fixing other people's problems and not being able to have this nuclear deterrent at it's the most important time to have it since the Cold War. So, yeah, Britain had a test of its Trident missile system, which is capable of carrying nuclear warheads. It failed. The last one also failed. We often joke about Russia's military capabilities, but if one goes through, we're screwed, and it doesn't look like we are able to defend ourselves. And of course, it's more concerning now that Russia is showing that it still wants what it wanted during the time of the Soviet Union, and with a potential, the next president might be somebody who said he will not defend his NATO allies and would actually encourage Russia to attack them. So sorry. So yeah, Britain should probably whatever resources are put towards telling Israel not to defend itself, or towards humanitarian aid, should probably be put towards Britain making sure that it can defend itself when the worst actors around the world decide that Britain is a target. Alejandro.
Well, I agree. I'm not a military expert. I don't know anything about rockets. So maybe, as the government says, this is just something that went wrong, but if we need it, it will work right. However, if you make a show about this, it better perform well, and it didn't, and it comes, as you say, in the worst possible moment. And if you want to tie it to the decadence of the West, it's a salient feature of it, with a lack of capability, and not because they're not good engineers, it's because we tie their hands whenever they need it, and we put a lot of money without expecting a lot of results.
Yeah. Looks like the issue is not actually the equipment. The equipment is the same that the Americans use. They have similar submarines and similar missiles. So, but the only difference that they know how to use them. It looks like it was an issue with our training and our testing procedure. But anyway, if China or Russia attack, fear not. At least they're not going to be misgendered by our army, because they are fully trained or recognize all different genders. So be happy under the point of view.
Yeah, a lot of the response to this has been like aha syndrome, a sort of nihilistic delight at failure for the same kind of people who like to watch people falling over in videos. But I think the response from the defense secretary, who was there on the submarine to witness this missile go straight up in the air and plop in the sea next to them, he said an anomaly did occur. Yeah, no shit, Sherlock. But he also said it's the most reliable weapon system in the world, he said, reading off the box that it came in. He described it as effective, dependable, and formidable. Well, it might be if, as Marcus said, you train the staff properly and you practice it properly. If Kim Jong-un can do a proper demonstration of a rocket, then we ought to be able to. And we ought to understand that a demonstration is not saber rattling or warmongering. It's a necessary demonstration of your ability to defend your own people, your own nation, particularly in this world that we live in today.
Thank you, Ginger. Ginger has been a member for 18 months. She says, right on, Marco. Okay, we are out of time. Alejandro, anything to add, anything to promote?
No, thank you.
Marco, Richard?
Yeah, go over after this to the Briefly Objective, the sister channel of Ayn Rand Center UK, and start watching video, share them. They are short as well, that you can easily embed in your tweets, messages and stuff. So go and spread the word.
The details are on the details under this this video. It says where there's for shorter content, go to this link. So please do that.
Yeah, and that is on the for those watching live, it's in the live chat. For those watching later, it's in the description. And yeah, those videos are short, bite-sized, shareable, very well edited by Marco and Richard. So make sure you like them, share them, subscribe to the channel. All right, what did I have anything of my own to promote? I'm at Razi Ginsburg on X. I think I may have wanted to say something else, but I don't remember what it was. Tomorrow we are discussing Rashida Tlaib on the Daily Objective. We're discussing Palestinian opposition. Is there such a thing? If so, what is it? We'll be discussing that on the reality show. I will have some tea and hopefully get my voice back for those shows. Thank you, everybody. Thank you guys for joining me. Thank you, everybody, for watching, for the super chats, for the comments. Thank you to the trolls for the engagement. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm. More people will see this content because of you, so keep it coming. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you back here tomorrow.
Thank you.